morning. My name is Neil Levesque, and I'm the Executive Director here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. I want to welcome you all to Climate and the Economy, this wonderful program on a great Monday morning. Before we get started, I'd like to just point out our new president of St. Anselm College here, Dr. Stephen DeSalvo, was here. He came down to hear us this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping items. This is a place for civility and public policy, so we ask you to keep that in mind. As we move forward, what I think we're going to do is I'm going to introduce all the panelists first to come up and take a quick seat. We have some outstanding folks, obviously here, and particularly Nancy Sutley, who is the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Nancy, why don't you come on up? I told her she gets introduced first because she came the longest distance. You can take a seat right here. In her role as chair, she serves as the principal environmental policy advisor to the president. Prior to her appointment, she was the deputy mayor for energy and environment for the city of Los Angeles, California. She represented Los Angeles on the board of directors for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California and served on the California State Water Resources Control Board from 2003 to 2005. She also worked for the governor of California, Gray Davis, as energy advisor, managing state and federal regulations, legislative affairs, finances, and press relations. She served as deputy secretary for policy and intergovernmental relations in the California EPA from 1999 to 2003, and she advised on water and air pollution policy and established budget and legislative priorities. During the administration of President Clinton, she worked for the EPA as a senior policy advisor to the regional administrator in San Francisco, special assistant to the administration in Washington, D.C. She holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University and a master in public policy from Harvard. I've heard of that. Next, we have Commissioner Jeff Rose. Jeff came the shortest distance. But Jeff lives right around the corner. He probably walked here today. He's our commissioner of what we call DREAD here in New Hampshire, which is Department of Resources and Economic Development. It's really the Commerce Department, if you will, for New Hampshire. He was former Director of Government Relations for BAE Systems, Electronic Solutions Line, Business and Electronics. Rose supported BAE's business goals through policy advocacy at the federal and state and local governments, as well as the growth management and strategic alignment of political resources for the company. I love these biographies. Hard to get through them. Also, we have Professor Cameron Wake. Professor? When I was getting these biographies, I looked online and saw his picture, which I'll invite you to go see. In the Arctic with a beard, it's all covered in ice. He is a research associate professor with the Institute for Study of Earth, Oceans, and Space at the University of New Hampshire, and also appointed to the UNH Department of Earth Sciences, where he teaches classes including global environmental change, Earth system science, climate and health. Cameron directs an active research program investigating regional climate and environmental change through the analysis of ice cores and instrumental records. Cameron also leads Carbon Solutions New England, public-private partnership, promoting collective action to achieve a clean, secure future while sustaining our unique cultural and natural resources. He serves as Chief Scientific Advisor for Clean Air, Cool Planet, something we know quite a bit about here in New Hampshire, a not-for-profit organization finding and promoting solutions to global warming. Last but not least, Peter Egelston. Peter? Peter is the president of one of my favorite companies, the Smutty Nose Brewing Company. Started in the brewing industry in 1986 in what is now the oldest brew pub in the Northeast, the Northampton Brewery in Massachusetts. He was head brewer there until 1991 when he opened New Hampshire's first brew pub, the Portsmouth Brewery. He later took over what was the Frank Jones Brewing Company and became Smutty Gnomes in 1993. He has recently embarked on a really wonderful project. It's a new brewery at Toll Farm in Hampton that's on our seacoast. The brewery, which is still under construction, is designed to achieve U.S. Green Building Council LEED Gold certification, meaning it's built not only to minimize impact on the historic site, but also the new facility will also maximize water efficiency, energy performance. And I invite you to go on that website and read about the building because that's fascinating in itself. Today, starting off, we have a great friend of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. I talk about her so much here that it's great to see her here. She's in several of the wonderful photographs around the room.
Don't tell people that.
She is the first and only woman in U.S. history to be elected both governor and a United States senator. Jeanne Shaheen has served New Hampshire citizens for decades. As a member of the Senate Committees on Foreign Relations, Appropriations, Armed Services, Small Business, and Entrepreneurship, Shaheen is working to improve our economy through increased exports, strengthening math and science education, and addressing our energy challenges. Before joining the Senate, Shaheen served 3 terms as governor of New Hampshire. She was also in the state Senate when I was an intern there many, many years ago. She and her husband, Bill, live in Madrid. Senator Shaheen.
So I promise, Neil, I won't tell any stories about your years in the state Senate as an intern. As long as you don't tell any about me. Well, good morning. Welcome, everyone. It's really nice to be able to join you. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to stay for the panel discussion because I know that will be fascinating. I thought Peter was going to bring everybody a beer, but he said no. Last Thursday, I was down at the Great Bay, and I had the opportunity to do a little bit of a hike on the new Sweet Trail there, which goes through some of the marshlands and the forests. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to have the New Hampshire Coastal Adaptation Workshop, so New Hampshire CAW, to have a chance to see some of the modeling that they have done on what will happen to the marshes around the Great Bay under various scenarios of climate change. And I will tell you that the scenarios are very frightening. With the worst one being if we do nothing to address climate change, our marshes around the Great Bay will be gone. As the result of the rising oceans and the impact not only on the landscape but on the potential for what that will mean in so many other areas is, as I said, nothing short of frightening. So I am very pleased to be here this morning to start you off as you talk about what we should be doing to address climate change in New Hampshire and how we can approach it at all levels, whether we're homeowners or business people or utilities or whatever we do, there is an opportunity for each of us to address it. Some of you may remember that when I was governor, we put in place what we call the New Hampshire Building Energy Conservation Initiative, the Becky program, which began to retrofit state buildings for emissions and to be more energy efficient. And as the result of that program, not only have we saved taxpayers about $2 to $4 million a year on the state's energy bills, but we've reduced carbon dioxide emissions by 37 tons annually. So that's the equivalent of taking 4,000 cars off the road. I was also proud as governor to sign into law legislation that restructured the electric markets here so that Initially, businesses could take advantage of other options for generation, and now homeowners can also take advantage of that. My experiences as governor and as someone who lived through the energy crises in the 70s made me very concerned about climate change when I ran for the Senate. It's one of the things that I wanted to work on when I got to Washington. And so I worked very hard to get on the Energy Committee and spent my first 4 years in the Senate as a member of the Energy Committee. And unfortunately, during those 4 years, not one energy bill got from the Senate to the floor. The House passed a cap and trade bill that never got taken up in the Senate. And after that experience, I thought, or as part of that experience, I thought a lot about what could we do to really make some progress around addressing our energy use in the country in a way that would reduce pollution. And after my experience both as a homeowner, and I won't go into, my husband and I built a house in Madbury in 1979 in the middle of the Iranian oil crisis, which we did a number of things to make it more energy efficient. But after that experience, after my experience as governor, after my experience on the Senate Energy Committee, I thought there's got to be a way to make some progress on this issue, this debate, because so much of it has been polarized with, and we saw this on the Energy Committee in the Senate, with those people who support fossil fuels, opposing anybody who supports alternatives or renewables, with the Midwest and the West and the South opposing both coasts and the Northeast in terms of energy use. And I thought, well, there's got to be something that we can all agree on. There's got to be a better way to do this if we're going to make some progress. And I came back to energy efficiency, because energy efficiency is the cheapest, fastest way to deal with our energy needs. It's something that if you support fossil fuels, if you support renewables, if you're from New England or from Louisiana or from North Dakota, we can all agree that we benefit from energy efficiency. And it used to be that people thought about energy efficiency as putting on a sweater and turning down the thermostat. Well, energy efficiency, as you're going to hear from the panel today, and many of you know already, is a whole range of technologies that have been developed. Many are off the shelf. We're not looking for new innovation, though innovations are happening all the time. But this is a way for us to address our energy needs that not only lowers cost, helps create jobs, reduces our dependence on foreign oil, and reduces emissions in a way that's dramatic. I've had the opportunity to visit a number of businesses around New Hampshire. In fact, I've spent the last couple of years doing that. And in the last few months, I've had a chance to visit Coca-Cola Bottling of Northern New England, and I've seen where they've been able to eliminate 2,000 truckloads of bottles annually because they have a new technology that they're using that blows their plastic bottles, and they're saving the energy use by reusing the air that it takes to blow out those bottles. I had a chance a couple of weeks ago to visit the Woodstock Inn in Woodstock and see what's been done. I visited the brewery too, but don't tell people that. But to see what they're doing to try and save in the inn, and his interest, obviously the benefits to the environment are important, but he said, I've saved $16,000 in the first 4 months of this year as a result of what I've done. So it's a cost savings. I had a chance to tour Raponi Toyota a couple of weeks ago, the first LEED certified auto dealer in New England. And they have everything from solar panels, efficient lighting, to an energy dashboard to monitor their energy use throughout the facility. And then, of course, on the job side, visited a number of companies like Warner Power, who are making the first breakthrough in a transformer, which is used throughout all of our buildings, in over 100 years. And if we can use that transformer widely throughout the country, we'd be able to save about 60 terawatts of electricity a year. That is equal to 5 times New Hampshire's annual electricity consumption. So on both sides of the ledger, we're seeing really exciting things happening around energy efficiency. And as the result of my experience, I worked with a number of groups and with Senator Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio, to introduce comprehensive energy efficiency legislation. We introduced it in the last Congress. We got it through the Senate Energy Committee with a very strong bipartisan vote of 18-3. Never made it to the floor of the Senate. This year, we got it through the committee with a 19-3 vote, a strong bipartisan vote. And the legislation does several things, and you have a one-page handout on your table which describes it. It addresses buildings, puts in place voluntary building codes, and provides some incentives to work with states and private industry to make the code writing process more transparent. It trains the next generation of workers in energy-efficient commercial building design and operation through university-based building training and research assessment centers. We know that addressing the building's use of energy is very important because that's about 40% of the energy used in the United States. And of course, as we all know, here in New Hampshire, it's a higher percentage than that because we have so many old buildings. The legislation also addresses industrial efficiency, which is the sector of our economy that uses the most energy. It directs the Department of Energy's Advanced Manufacturing Office to work more closely with the private sector to encourage research, development, and commercialization of innovative energy-efficient technology. Helps businesses reduce their energy use and become more competitive by incentivizing the use of more efficient electric motors and transformers. As I said, that is a significant part of our energy use in this country. It establishes a voluntary Supply Star program that's modeled on Energy Star to try and encourage businesses to look at their supply chains and see where the energy use is coming from. And then finally, it addresses the federal government's use of energy. The federal government is the biggest user of energy, as Nancy will attest, in the world. And of course, about 93% of that energy is used by the military, who, by the way, are really very forward-thinking in terms of what they're doing to address their energy use. The Navy has a goal of reducing their energy use 50% by 2020, and they are well on the way to doing that. So this is legislation that I think is a win-win-win. According to the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, by 2020, if we had passed the bill last year, it would have saved consumers $4 billion, created 80,000 jobs, and been the equivalent of taking 5 million cars off the road. Now, the good thing is the bill is on the floor of the Senate, and it is the first energy bill. It is the first energy bill to come to the floor of the Senate since 2007. When we go back to Washington on September 9th, we will be on the bill. So we expect some amendments, a robust debate, but it's exciting that we are dealing with energy finally. And we actually have a shot at getting legislation through the House as well. There is a bipartisan bill that's been introduced in the House by our neighbor Peter Welch, and Representative McKinley, who is a Republican from West Virginia. The leadership in the House, both the chairman of the committee, Fred Upton, and one of the members of their leadership have talked about trying to address energy efficiency. So I think this is legislation that has a real shot at getting through. And one of the lessons for me, in addition to the importance of energy efficiency, one of the lessons has been that there probably is no magic silver bullet. And I know I'm not telling you anything you all don't already know. But we've got to think about what we can do incrementally that continues to make progress on this issue. And we've got to think about how we can do it in so many ways, because clearly climate change is having an impact on New Hampshire, on the country, and on the world. And we've got to think about how we're going to address that in a way that can bring people together, build some consensus, and if you don't want to do it because you don't believe in climate change, you think it's not happening, it's not real, but you're able to do something that saves you money and helps address climate change, then by golly, that's what we ought to be doing. Because we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good as we're looking at how we make progress on this issue. And I know that your panelists are going to give you their insights this morning in a way that will give us all a lot more to think about. But I think we've got a huge challenge, but we've also got a real opportunity. And we need to think about where we can seize those opportunities and make a difference on this issue. So thank you all very much for your attention, for your interest, and for being here this morning. And go, panel.
Can everyone hear me? Is it good? So, starting off with our panel, since Nancy, you came the longest way, I wanted to see if you could give us a federal overview of the current situation.
Well, thanks. Good morning and welcome to all of you, and thank you all for being here, and thank you particularly to St. Anselm College and the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, and to Senator Shaheen for being a part of this. It's a great opportunity, as we've been talking, to talk about a very important issue. And as the Senator said, climate change isn't it's not just an environmental issue. There are public health issues associated, and certainly economic issues, and we're seeing already the impact of climate change and carbon pollution all across the country and here in New Hampshire. We think about extreme weather events, and they cause millions of dollars in damage every year in places all around the country, and certainly here in New Hampshire, and not New Hampshire alone. In 2012, the cost of weather disasters in the U.S. exceeded $110 billion just for 2012. And of course, a lot of that was as a result of Hurricane Sandy, which hit all along the East Coast. And so those impacts of extreme weather events, I think, are very much on people's minds. So this morning, the Obama administration's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force just released its rebuilding strategy that's looking at how we ensure that we are doing things in a coordinated way across the region, and also to take a resilient approach to rebuilding after a storm like Hurricane Sandy. So the task force was made up of a lot of federal agencies working closely in states and communities all around the region. Has been focused on how do we cut red tape and get assistance to people who need it effectively and efficiently, but also to look at how we can, as the federal government, set consistent standards and give communities tools and information they need to rebuild more resiliently. And that the reason that this is important is that we can't just focus on the last storm. I think it's important to focus on recovery from storms, but also how do we build stronger for the next one. So if you look at that, climate change models, extreme weather events like these kinds of storms, floods and wildfires, droughts, heat waves are expected to grow more frequent and more severe because of climate change. And that means the costs and the health impacts and impacts on communities that come along with them. So, we can come up with many kinds of examples of the ways that the kind of changes we're seeing in the climate as a result of carbon pollution threaten the health of our families, particularly vulnerable populations. You see with warmer temperatures that there's more smog, more soot, and higher pollen levels that lead to potentially to more asthma attacks, looking at other public health risks like longer allergy seasons, which make everybody miserable, increases in heat-related illnesses, and changes in distribution of insects and diseases that accompany them. And these aren't issues that are in some far-off future. We're starting to see them today. We were talking earlier about changes in fisheries in New England, the appearance of species from warmer waters now appearing more frequently, consistently in waters off of New England. So in June, the President laid out his comprehensive plan to reduce carbon pollution. That will help to move our economy towards American-made clean energy sources, to stress the importance of energy efficiency, as Senator Shaheen talked about, and begin to prepare our communities and our country to deal with the effects of climate change. And the President said, we have a moral obligation to our children and to future generations to ensure that we don't leave them a planet that's damaged and polluted. So the President's plan includes a number of steps. We think they're steady and responsible steps to address climate change, including new rules to limit carbon pollution from power plants. As a country today, we have limits on the kind of pollution that comes out of power plants, and things like arsenic and mercury and lead and sulfur dioxide and other things, but we don't have any limits on how much carbon pollution power plants can release. So, this is an issue that touches every part of our country, and modernizing our power plants with this the newest technologies to reduce carbon emissions, that will improve our health, that will make sure that we stay competitive with other countries and move our economy towards cleaner, more efficient sources of energy. We have made some historic investments as a country in clean energy jobs and clean energy industries through a lot of different programs that have helped to support tens of thousands of renewable energy projects, including a number of them here in New Hampshire. And with the help of these projects, we've met a goal that the President set out in 2008, which is to double the amount of energy we produce from renewable sources like wind and solar. And so this year, the President said, we did that, we met that goal, why don't we try again to double our renewable energy generation by 2020. And I know this is an important issue here in New Hampshire. You already get about 25% of electricity from renewable energy sources, or you will get 25% of your electricity from renewable energy by 2025, and that's the kind of leadership we're seeing in states around the country. But even as we take these steps to reduce the pollution that is contributing to climate change, we have to prepare for the impacts that we're already feeling. And so the President's Climate Action Plan looks at how we can better partner as a federal government with communities all across the country to prepare for the impacts of climate change by investing in stronger and safer infrastructure, by protecting critical sectors of our economy and protecting our natural resources, and giving local decision makers the kinds of tools, the scientific tools that they need to help make good decisions and well-informed decisions. And all of this taken together, I think, we believe will move the country in a place that we need to go to address impacts of climate change, but it also, I think, builds on a lot of the work we've already done to reduce pollution in our communities, to advance our energy security, and to invest in clean energy jobs and in clean energy industries of the future. And a few of those things I point out is in 2011, the administration established the first ever national standards for mercury, arsenic, and other toxic air pollution from power plants. It's been a big issue here in New England. These standards will help to prevent thousands of premature deaths, heart attacks, hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma symptoms, and result in what we believe to be about $90 billion of health benefits to our health and to our economy. with the support of the auto industry and with the support of states like New Hampshire, we put in place the toughest fuel economy standards in the world for vehicles. These will cut our carbon pollution in half from cars by 2025 and save the average driver more than $8,000 at the gas pump. So these are some of the ways that we're working to keep our communities safe, communities healthy and resilient. And we know and the real leaders in this are people in their own communities and their own states taking action to help get our country where we need to go. So thanks for having me here. Thanks for all of you for being here, and look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. So when you were talking about communities and the local activities and natural resources, that tees up Jeff pretty well, because he's in charge of not only our natural resources, but as I mentioned, the business health in New Hampshire is his direct responsibility. The pressure. But just so I was thinking that maybe you could take over and say what your department is doing, highlighting some of the things here.
Sure, I appreciate it, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here at the Institute of Politics this afternoon to talk about a very important topic. And as Neil referenced, I have the distinct pleasure of serving as the Commissioner of the state's Department of Resources and Economic Development. So we have a pretty far-reaching agency that we deal with everything from our state's travel and tourism to our parks, to our forests and lands, and the healthy well-being of our state's economy. So when you talk about each of those components, climate plays a very, very important role. And we've seen that we're significantly impacted in each one of those 4 divisions based on some of the changes that we see and the sensitivities that we have. And one of the things that I think we've always really prided ourselves on in New Hampshire is that we have a connectivity to our natural resources that is a true discriminator for the state. We love our outdoors. We love our mountains and our lakes and our rivers, and really it's a fabric of which I think makes New Hampshire such a special place. And in order to be able to maintain and protect and promote that, we have to provide that constant balance that we have. When people think of New Hampshire, when we're out talking to other parts of the state, and even within our own state, but when we're focus grouping and talking about the state, people associate it with our natural resources, the pristine environment, the beauty that we have in the state, the wildlife that we have. And so it's working collectively with those things that I think we have to make sure that we promote and protect in order to continue to maintain that balance. One of the areas where I think it's probably most easy to identify with is within travel and tourism, which happens to be our second largest industry within the state. We have approximately 34 million people who come into the state every year, and they spend nearly $4.5 billion. So that's a major driver of our state's economy, providing about 63,000 jobs to help support that industry, and is a major source of the rooms and meals taxes that help us run our state government. But when you start and think about how sensitive that is in terms of how certain conditions can change that travel and tourism industry, things like weather are right at the very top. National trends, gas prices, these things have real impacts. But 2 of those top industries that are, I think, kind of the harbingers of travel and tourism are both skiing and snowmobiling. And again, these are industries that are within the fabric of our state. Kind of distinguishes our state. When people think about New Hampshire, they think about the rich history that we have within our skiing. We have 32 different ski resorts or ski areas throughout the state. And again, that's over $900 million in direct and indirect spending that takes place, providing nearly 19,000 jobs. So it's a very, very important part of our industry. But this past year was a good season. But just 2 years ago, 2012, we didn't have a lot of snow. It was a very little snow year. And then we had some very unseasonably warm weather in early March, and basically shut down the ski industry about 3 weeks earlier than that would typically occur. And when you're talking about a season of 12, 15, 16 weeks or so, you cut 20% of your season, 25% of your season, and that's going to leave a mark. In fact, I know at least Cannon Mountain, which is the mountain that the state operates, we were off about 25% as a result of that. So, that has a real impact from an economic perspective as well as a travel and tourism perspective. And our snowmobiling industry, similar things. That's again north of almost $600 million to our state's economy, and driven really the northern part of our state really drives a lot of its economic value and activity around snowmobiling, and that's a huge industry. And we saw in 2012, in 1 year, a 50% drop in the number of registrations for snowmobiles. So that then reduces the revenues that come in, which then reduces the amount of resources that we can provide to local municipalities to maintain their trails, to enhance their trails, to promote their trails. And so it really takes a real impact at the state level and at the local level when you see years like 2012 take place. Within our park system, we have some really great parks throughout the state. Everything from Hampton Beach to the top of Mount Washington to Pawtuckaway to Whitefield. It's just some amazing, wonderful parks. And it's a self-sustained fund, so the revenues that are generated at the parks is how we operate. And we see that weather can have as much as a 40% swing in our revenues. Even in just this year, this last weekend doesn't get much better than that. The last couple of weekends, and our parks have been producing at a very high level, high utilization rates. People are really enjoying the outdoor recreational opportunities. But think back to Memorial Day weekend and how miserable that was. I mean, we literally had snow in parts of our state, and that's not real good for tent camping when you get snow on Memorial Day weekend. And so our revenues were significantly off. They were off over between 25 and 30% just from that weekend, and we've been trying to catch up the entire year. And we're just about there, so I think we're in pretty good shape there. But our parks and our visitors to our parks, we estimate about $6 million a year. And again, that's an additional $500 million to our state's economy and supporting over 8,000 jobs. So I mean, it's really important in terms of how sensitive our revenue structures and the beauties of our state can be due to weather events. And Neil can appreciate this as well, but you start thinking about the ice storms that we experienced in the state, whether it was 98 or 2007. I mean, these were, episodes that were hard to fully digest and comprehend on the impacts that they were going to have to the health of our forests, but also to the way that our businesses have to evaluate and consider how weather in these extremes can impact them. You don't necessarily anticipate having no power for a week or 2 weeks. And then what do? What's your business continuity when you have to meet the deadlines and the demands to help fulfill and support your customers? What do you do if you don't have electricity because of these extreme events? My previous role prior to serving in this, I worked at a company called EA Systems. And we had in our upstate New York during Hurricane or Tropical Storm Irene, a facility that was along a river that broke its banks. We had 20 million gallons of water in our manufacturing facility. It was just gone, 1,400 people, and the facility was now gone. It was no longer habitable. And you have to meet the needs of your businesses, and you have to have that business continuity, and there's not room for excuses. And so you have to think about that in a whole new way that you didn't previously. And as the Senator referenced, energy efficiency is essential, but it's more than just that now. It has to be burned into the way that you plan to think about how you're going to operate your business. You're thinking about things like your supplier bases, thinking about things like how you would manage if you didn't have power for 2 weeks. It's a pretty dramatic thought process and change. I mean, just in the last decade, we've had 5 100-year storms. well, I don't know if 100-year storms anymore, but I mean, these things dramatically impact businesses and your ability to transport your goods and services that you're trying to offer. So all these things are very interconnected, and they all play a very sensitive role in preserving the unique New Hampshire experience that I think we all really appreciate. And again, whether that means our natural resources, whether that means it's our travel and tourism, or whether that's how our businesses are going to fundamentally be successful here in the state, you cannot dismiss the importance that our climate plays in each one of those capacities. So I appreciate the senators, her work in trying to help bring leadership to this issue, talking about the importance of energy efficiency. Not only is it good for the environment, but certainly good for business. And I think in New Hampshire we've always found that way of sort of providing that balance. I think is needed for us to be able to continue to enjoy the unique attributes of our state.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Ice storm, skiing, snowmobiling. We're ready to get our shovels out, I think. Very good. You wouldn't know what that is, though, because you're from Los Angeles. Cameron, I think it's wonderful that the fact is that New Hampshire has such an expert here. Not many states do, obviously, and your background, what UNH is doing in general is outstanding. So I was thinking that you could add a little light to what you're doing over at UNH.
All right, thanks, Neil. I really want to try and make 3 points, actually, in my brief comments today. The first one is climate changes. Climate always has changed, and climate always will change. What's really different today is that humans are the main drivers of that change. So there is an overwhelming body of scientific evidence that shows that's the case, and that humans are the main driving of a warming planet since around 1970. That's really been proven in thousands of papers that have been published in the scientific literature. What's happened in New Hampshire? We've seen our winters warm dramatically. Our winters are now, on average, 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they used to be. That's the equivalent of taking a Boston climate and shifting it south to Philadelphia. That's already happened. We've seen, perhaps most shockingly, extreme precipitation events increase. Where we used to experience 1 or 2 precipitation events that dropped 4 inches of rain in a decade, so 4 inches of rain in 48 hours, but we used to see 1 or 2 events in a decade. We now see in some places 1 or 2 events per year. That, combined with the fact that in many areas we're actually paving over significant portions of our watershed, means we've seen more flooding, and I would expect that all of you have a flooding or 3 stories to tell over the course of the last decade, and it's really impacted our economy in many different ways, and you heard one example from Jeff. There's other impacts, though. We're seeing, those cold winter nights you really don't like much? They're actually really beneficial for getting rid of a whole bunch of pests and weeds that we don't like. And so now we're seeing the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid. It's getting up into New Hampshire, up into Maine. Those pests are actually killed by one night when it's below 18 degrees centigrade. We're not getting those as frequently, and we're not going to get those in the future. And then we've also seen the spread of Lyme disease, which is obviously a very complex disease and has many different vectors, and it's related to deer populations, but also related to that lack of cold winters, but also precipitation in summer. And we're seeing areas that are warmer have more Lyme disease, and we're suffering from that. So we've clearly seen climate change in New Hampshire already. I just finished writing an assessment of climate change in the future for the state of New Hampshire. It'll hit the street this fall. But really we have 2 pathways that we can go in the future. One, which I would argue, if we just continue emitting carbon pollution to the atmosphere, will result in change that we will be unable to adapt to maintain our quality of life. Conversely, if we reduce our emissions through energy efficiency or renewable technologies, there is going to be change that we have to deal with, a change that we could adapt to while maintaining our quality of life. There's one little vignette, talk a little bit about snowmobiling and skiing. My favorite winter sport, pond hockey, has also been affected pretty dramatically. And there's this wonderful pond hockey classic that's run up on Lake Winnipesaukee where 1,500 men and women get together and play hockey, and you might imagine drink a little beer for a weekend. In 2012, they had to move the entire event from Lake Winnipesaukee because it wasn't frozen on February 1st. I mean, it was unbelievable. All right, so that's my first point. Climate change always has and always will. We're the main drivers of our change. The second is that over the course of 25 years of studying climate change, it has become a moral issue for me. And there's at least two ways that I think about this. The first is when I drove over here today with Peter, albeit in a fuel-efficient car, we emitted greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere for over 100 years. I get all the benefit of burning that energy, and I'm putting the impact on future generations. I just don't think that's the right way to operate. The other way to think about it is it's those who are the most vulnerable who suffer the most from climate change. Those who are live in poverty, those who are sick, those who are young, and those who are old. Those of us with resources are actually going to be able to adapt. So the people who are most vulnerable who are going to suffer the most. And you really need look no further than Hurricane Katrina or Superstorm Sandy to see that that is very clearly the case. If you have money, you get out of town. If you don't, you're sort of stuck suffering through the storm. And I also don't think that's a really good way to operate. Third and last, and this really builds upon, I think, some wonderful points that Jeff made, is it's really not about the environment versus the economy. It's about the environment and the economy. We need to replace the tyranny of the or for the opportunity of the and. And I want to just finish up with two examples. The first one comes straight from the Climate Action Plan that the state of New Hampshire wrote. There's several authors in the audience tonight, and it was commissioned by then Governor Lynch. And one of the examples we looked at was improving energy efficiency in homes. So overall, there's about 500,000 homes in New Hampshire, and overall they're pretty inefficient. So the suggestions that came up through the working groups was, let's raise the efficiency of those homes so they use 60% less fossil fuel energy than they do today. We estimated it would cost $30,000 a home, sorry, $35,000 a home, 30,000 homes a year, 15 years, right? Very little of that work can be outsourced. That is an economic driver that requires significant upfront investment, but really provides tremendous economic return because those jobs have to be here. It also, not only do we end up using less energy, but we actually build resilience to external drivers on fuel costs in the future. So if we use less oil and natural gas, we're less at the whim of global markets for those. So it actually makes sense for our economy, and it makes sense for our future in the state of New Hampshire. And in fact, all across the Midland, because we don't produce fossil fuels. It doesn't make sense for us to keep spending all those money on fossil fuels because it just leaves our economy. So then a second example of the environment versus, if the first one we can sort of put in the realm of making money, the second one we can put in the realm of saving money. And if you look at the number of presidentially declared disasters in the state of New Hampshire over the last 20 years, you see a shocking change in 2005. It goes from about $0 to $3 to $4 million per year for those years when there was a presidentially declared weather disaster, except for 1998 during the big ice storm. And then in 2005 it jumps up to something on the order of 20 million. And then it continues, except for 2009, at the $20 to $30 million level. So that's an indication of weather extremes and changing climate. Also probably an indication of being built in places that are more vulnerable. But these weather extremes are costing us money. And we can't just deal with cleaning up after the storm, as Nancy has suggested. We need to begin preparing for these. We need to make our communities more resilient so they can bounce back more quickly. And the example that Jeff provided, I think, is a really good one. If you're running a business, what are you going to do in light of this climate extreme? Are you going to let it hit, not be prepared, and be shut down for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks while you're making no money? Or do you prepare for that event because you know it's coming, right? Climate science is telling you these events are coming. All of our projections for future climate show that we're going to be getting more rain and fewer events and more flooding, and we're developing our watersheds. Floods are going to be more a part of our life in the future than they have been in the past. We need to start preparing for these. Businesses need to start planning that in a much more holistic way, as Jeff has suggested, and communities need to start doing that so that we save taxpayer money. Right? This is a problem that is not going away. We need to begin planning for it now. And there are wonderful examples across the state of communities that are starting to do this, but it really starts with acknowledging there's a problem and identifying where you are vulnerable and then beginning to deal with those vulnerabilities. And here's the good news, amongst the guy who usually just brings people bad news, is that we don't have to sort of prepare for rising seas or all the floods tomorrow or next year. We have time to deal with this. But what it requires is planning and identifying financial resources and human capital to really focus on those problems to make our communities more resilient. So it needs to be a conversation around the dinner table, in all of our town councils, by our regional counties, and at the state level. Everybody needs to be dealing with how we make our communities more resilient. And in the end, those communities that are more resilient are the ones that are going to be able to bounce back and actually be far more economically viable. And I have no doubt that businesses in the future are going to look specifically for those communities that are able to deal with this problem of climate change, specifically because they're going to be able to bounce back.
Thank you very much. Peter, tell us what it's like from a business owner's perspective.
Oh, I wish I had a beer right now.
Thanks to us.
Well, thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about both ends of our sphere of activities to begin with, our supply chain as well as our distribution chain. And then I also want to talk a little bit about some of the things we're doing as a company, specifically touching on energy efficiency, building efficiency. As you mentioned, we're building a new facility, so I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. As most of you know, beer is made with 4 ingredients: malted barley, hops, yeast, and the biggest ingredient is obviously water. Hops and barley are agricultural products. They're traded on a global market, and they are influenced by global activities. In 2007, our price of our pale malt, our silent malt, went from 22 cents a pound to 44 cents a pound. That was the cost of our primary raw material literally doubled overnight. Why did that happen? Well, it was kind of an alignment, an unfortunate alignment of stars, if you will. Part of it had to do with robust economies. Remember those? In Asia, primarily in China and India. When people have a little more money in their pockets, they tend to buy things, and one of the things they buy is beer. And people in China and India like to drink beer as much as the rest of us do. So as those economies were growing, they were bidding up the price of raw materials, malt and barley. At the same time, there were a couple of significant drought conditions in sort of breadbasket regions of the world, and in this case, primarily Australia, interestingly. How could something happening in Australia and China and India affect our price of malted barley? Well, it does, because it's traded as a global commodity. So we and every other brewer in the country really took a shot to the ribs in 2007. Not to mention the fact that our price of hops went up. In that case, it went from $4.50 a pound to $16 a pound. That was not as easily attributable to climate, but it just was a really bad coincidence that happened at the same time. So our supply is very, very much tied directly to climate occurrences. And so that's something I'm very, very conscious of all the time. We've seen our price of malted barley creep back down. This year we paid about 34 cents a pound. So we're never going to see the price it was back in 2007, but it is starting to creep back down. Will it jump right back up again? Absolutely, and it could at the drop of a hat. And that's one of the things that keeps me awake at night, I have to say. On the other side of that, last fall, we and many, many other businesses in this country were directly impacted by Superstorm Sandy that blew through the eastern seaboard. As an example, our wholesale distributor in New York City, which is located in an industrial section of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, And its warehouse sits right next to a little creek that feeds into the East River. Now, in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, a creek is actually a concrete culvert, and if you didn't know it was there, you probably wouldn't even know it was there. Unfortunately, when the storm came through, the storm surge coincided with the incoming tide, which went up the East River, and the warehouse of our wholesaler was hit with an 8-foot wall of water that within about 40 minutes took out 500,000 cases of beer, wiped out their entire fleet of trucks, their entire inventory. And that really wasn't the worst of it. They actually were pretty resilient. They bounced back fairly quickly, and they were delivering beer within 2 weeks. At the same time that was happening, most of our customers in the city were directly impacted as well. By customers, I'm talking about the places that sell our beer, not to mention the people who actually buy it. A tremendous number of bars and restaurants are put out of business, some of whom have still not even reopened all this time later. And stores, big supermarket in Red Hook in the southern part of Brooklyn was literally wiped out, and now again by the same storm surge in a matter of minutes. So even though this is stuff that happened hundreds and hundreds of miles away from us, it impacted our business dramatically and in a way that really affected us for the long run. If you look at our sales in the fourth quarter of last year, they were pretty paltry, and that was largely because of that. And my story is probably very similar to a lot of businesses can tell you very similar things. On the other hand, we are working towards trying to improve our own energy efficiency, reducing our carbon footprint. As Neil mentioned, we're building a new brewery. It's been a wonderful opportunity to design a purpose-built facility from the ground up. It's amazing the kinds of things you can do when you design something from scratch. The energy use in our new building will be, per square foot, will be a fraction of what we use in our existing facility. And then a lot of it is very simple stuff. You start with a well-insulated building envelope, and then you work from there. Then you can start adding sexier things like solar tubes to bring daylighting into the building. The photovoltaic controls on your interior lighting, so the lights only come on when it's needed. We generate a tremendous amount of waste heat from the refrigeration that we need to cool our beer tanks down. The new facility will be recovering all that waste heat to warm the building in the winter and to heat up our process water. And again, that's basically free stuff. We just had to design it in from the get-go. We have been able to make a lot of these decisions for a couple of reasons, primarily because we are owner-occupiers of this building. Consequently, the return on the investment that we need can have a much longer horizon because we're going to be there. One of the things that I think, and again, I'm not here to dictate policy or suggest policy, but one of the things that I believe would be very helpful would be to find ways for developers who are not going to be owner-occupants to have the same kind of incentive that an owner-occupant has to make investments that don't have to return within a 2 or 3 year horizon. Smarter people than me will have to figure out how to make that happen, but I definitely see our situation where we've been able to make choices in the design and construction of our buildings specifically because we are committed to it for the long run. The other thing in that regard is, as someone who owns a business and does business in the market, I'm a big believer in markets. I'm a big believer in market-driven incentives as well as disincentives. And I have to say, one of the things that we've really been very cognizant of in construction of this new facility are the incentives that we have been able to consider in terms of investing in energy-efficient technologies. These are incentives that are administered by our local utility, which in our case down in Hampton is Unitil. And they've been extremely helpful in kind of holding our hands and walking us through and making some of these decisions. We opted, for example, to put in our high bay lighting in the building, we opted to put in LED lighting. Frightfully expensive. The operating costs are a tiny, tiny fraction of even the most efficient fluorescent lights, which are kind of the next best thing. We would not have made that decision to put in LED lighting if we hadn't gotten a small percentage. And it's not a huge percentage, but it's enough of a percentage of the cost of that rebated to us through the program that the utility manages. It was enough to tip the scales in the favor of making that decision, which has a long-term implication in terms of the energy use of the building, and more importantly to me, in terms of the operating cost of the building as well. I do believe that businesses can make good choices with respect to their energy use that have an impact on their carbon footprint and ultimately on starting to address the questions of climate change. I think there are good business reasons for making these decisions. And I think more and more businesses are doing that. You hear some people say, well, that's fine for you because yours is a privately owned company and you can make those decisions. You don't have to answer to stockholders. And I'll just do one little, if you'll permit me, one little bit of editorializing here. I think that's a terrible cop-out. I'm so tired of hearing the discussion about businesses and the bad decisions that they make because that's what they think their stockholders want. You know what? Stockholders are people just like anybody else, and I think people do want to make good decisions, and I think most people would like the companies whose stock they own to be making good decisions as well, and not cut corners and make bad decisions sort of on their behalf. So that's, I'll get off the soapbox there. I just wanted to say that. Again, I'm a big believer that the solution, one of the many solutions to addressing the challenge that we face in terms of climate change is going to come from businesses large and small, and it will be probably not big, broad brushstrokes, but a lot of decisions made by businesses and individual people along the way, the aggregate of which, if we do it right, we're smart about it, and forward thinking, should get us, move us in the direction we need to go. And it's an ongoing journey, though, and that's something that we are always saying internally, is that our attempt to become a more sustainable company is a journey, and it's never gonna, we'll never say we've arrived, but we're making steps forward as we go.
Thank you, Peter. You're not the first person to make an editorial comment in this room. We're going to take a few questions. We have a microphone that'll go around the room. Please wait for the microphone because the cameras will pick you up. And if not, the audience who's watching on TV will be able to see it. There's a question.
Thank you so much. My name is Lucy Edwards and I'm from Northwood, which is a small town on Route 4 between Concord and Portsmouth. Used to be mainly antique shops, but the antique alley hasn't done too well in the recent economy. I've been involved with my town as a selectman and other committees, and I'm currently serving on the planning board there. And, you know, small towns in New Hampshire are kind of like little businesses, too. And right now, on our planning board, we have at least one, maybe more people, because I'm new on it, who are climate change deniers. And I wanted to ask you, as I'm thinking about planning for the future of our town, we're in the midst of our master plan update right now. Is this, first of all, is this discussion going to be available I can possibly show this to the planning board? I think that's my main question, because this has been wonderful. And particularly the business stuff, because we're looking at trying to do some economic development in our town. And that point that businesses look for communities that are preparing for climate change, which the professor from UNH made, is something that I'm going to be repeating on Thursday night when I go to the planning board meeting. But so that's my question: is this going to be available?
Yes, we'll get you a DVD.
Thank you.
That's easy. Cameron, do you want to take the question?
Sure. There certainly continues to be some climate change deniers out there. I think two things that I would suggest is don't get bogged down in the science with them. In fact, I don't even debate climate science in public because the debate about climate science happens in the scientific literature. I want you to memorize these words. There is an overwhelming body of scientific evidence that shows humans are changing the climate system. We're also finishing up, I mentioned a climate change assessment report for southern New Hampshire, which really sticks with the facts, right, of what's happened already. So even if you don't believe in human-driven climate change, and this is the second point, I think what you can really do is look at the changes that have happened already and ask the question, how is it that we're protecting our community from the changes we have seen already in Northwood? And obviously it's not only climate change, but it's development change. Southern New Hampshire has really seen this dramatic increase in extreme precipitation events, and that's something Northwood needs to be preparing for. I would sort of go along that line of, let's deal with what we've seen already as opposed to getting bogged down in talking about the science of climate change. And if they're really interested in the health and welfare of the residents of Northwood, I think they can open their eyes and see what's happening already. And as the senators change, there's a lot we can do whether or not you believe that humans are driving climate change. One last point is that there's many communities around the state. There's a few people in the audience who know much more about this than I do, but who are now saving money because they've made their municipal buildings much more energy efficient. And so for me, it comes back, there's a taxpayer issue here. Why are we wasting our money sending warm air out of really leaky buildings? We should be making our buildings as efficient as possible so that we reduce the amount of money that our town is spending on heating and cooling.
Excellent. Next question.
Barry. Pardon me for not standing. My name is Barry Conway from Hampton. I have two questions, if I may. One for the professor. I use kind of an analogy for this. If one is a smoker and then stops smoking, the body almost automatically begins to repair the damage and make one whole again, if you will. Can we do the same thing with climate change, or what's done is done?
Wow, that's a great analogy. I would say that, tragically, I had an aunt who stopped smoking when she was about 65 and died of lung cancer 5 years later. So the whole healing part, I think there's some significant damage done there. The Earth as a system will absolutely repair itself. We have times in the past when there's been far more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it goes up and down. But I think what's critical here is that it's going to take centuries, if not millennia, because we're putting so much carbon into the atmosphere. The way that carbon comes out of the atmosphere, whether it's absorbed into the oceans or absorbed into trees, is going to take a long time. Even worse than that is that if we really continue on this business as usual scenario, the catastrophic climate effects are really going to affect humans and the entire sort of biological system in really dramatic ways that will end up in significant extinctions that will make the Earth system a very different place. So thousands of years from now, will the Earth survive and will there be life forms on it? Absolutely, I have no doubt. But they could be very different, and there could be an immense amount of suffering depending on what path we go on. And so one paper I recently read out of Nature magazine talks about if we just keep pumping stuff into the atmosphere in a few hundred years, the tropics will be too warm for any mammals to live unless they have air conditioning, which means humans might live there, but no other mammals will be able to survive the tropical region. So we're talking about significant change that would take a long time.
Thank you. If I may ask one more for the Nancy, is it? The Obama, representing the Obama administration. A colleague and I were having a discussion not so long ago, And I said, all this coal that we have in the country, we have enough coal to provide the energy and power for, for this country for centuries and decades, whatever. Not an expert in this at all. And I said to him, so as we're cleaning the coal, and he said, we're not cleaning the coal. And I'm just scratching my head thinking, well, all the technology, can't we clean coal? And, you're just, okay, it's a fossil fuel, it's something that we're living with now, but, is there any way of cleaning coal so that, again, it's not negatively affecting the environment, and yet it's helping us in the transition to a clean environment?
Well, I think I'm not a technology expert, but I think that there are things that we can do. We rely a lot on fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, and will for many decades, even as we grow renewable energy industries, and even as we continue to make the kinds of investments and more investments in energy efficiency. So we are going to continue to use fossil fuels for many decades to come. For coal, there are ways to use coal more cleanly. There are kinds of technologies to make the burning of coal more efficient. Unfortunately, many of the power plants in the United States are very old, and they don't have that kind of technology. So there's opportunities to invest in those kinds of technologies. The other thing that applies really to any carbon-emitting source is the potential to capture the carbon and sequester it. So there's been a lot of research and development and investment in technology to improve ways to store, to sequester carbon, and capture it from power plants and from other ways that carbon is released. What sort of the next real breakthrough is going to have to be is to make that kind of technology available commercially in a cost-effective way. And so that's sort of the next thing to do. But I think as we look across energy technologies, and there are other things that we can do. For example, one thing that is highlighted in the Climate Action Plan is that when we produce oil and gas, for example, we release a lot of methane into the atmosphere. Well, that methane can be captured and used to produce energy. But methane is also a global warming gas, and yet we're letting sort of money go out, into being vented and flared in oil and gas production. So there's some opportunities there to do this. Professor Teddy and the economy and the environment and energy also. So there are promising technologies. The administration has started to support research and development. And the Department of Energy created something called ARPA-E, which is a way to prove new technologies. So we think that there's opportunities there.
Next question.
Thank you. I'd like to preface my remarks with something that Bruce Swigler, excuse my speech, I have an infection. I'm not drunk as I seem. Bruce Swigler said something back in the 80s, which I think is germane here. He was the weatherman at WBC, he's probably dead now. But he gave a talk one night and he said that in the evening news, watch all the articles, all the little things you see. And the one with the greatest economic impact every night will be the weather. If we get a report that it's going to rain tomorrow, the beaches will suffer economically. And that change will probably be greater than the crash of 22 buses in Congress and all that. But the weather on a normal scale has tremendous economic impact. Now, the other thing was that without arguing to what percentage the carbon introduction and human activities are adding to the heat of the atmosphere and the changes we've got. We know that the earth changes anyway. Here in New Hampshire, we were under a whole lot of ice not that long ago. I don't remember it, but my father told me about it. So we can expect very, very cold and very extremes that we're talking about. And Plan A that's going on right now is how do we address the extremes that are caused by human intervention. But should we absolutely completely eliminate that magically? We would still expect change. And what is Plan B to address the natural changes that are going on? We seem to be focused on only one element, but the buildings we build and the stuff that we do has to address what's going to happen even if we fix human intervention. And if anybody has any ideas, is there a Plan B?
Sure. I think it's pretty hard to think about Plan B when the overwhelming change is being driven by human action. So short-term climate change is driven really by two things naturally. There's variations in solar energy, 11-year cycle, and there's changes in volcanic eruptions. The solar cycle actually in general is pretty easy to predict. In specific is pretty difficult. Sometimes it's bigger, sometimes it's smaller, it's always the same length. But we also have a pretty good idea of what the impact on climate is on that. Volcanic eruptions are a lot more difficult. But once again, the change that we're seeing in the future is being driven almost entirely, what we're really feeling, by human beings. There's natural climate variability, there's natural variability in the system that we're always going to have to deal with. So yeah, it's really hard for me to think about dealing with sort of climate change from solar variability when it's such a small percentage of the change that we're seeing. And frankly, I don't think there's, we're not going to be solving the human-driven climate change problem anytime soon, right? We're only going to, it's really a matter of degrees. How much change do we have to adapt to, right? So there's change that's already locked into the system. Because of the lifetime of carbon in the atmosphere, which is well over 100 years now, plus because of sort of the enormous flywheel nature, the inertia in the climate system itself. So even if we stop emissions tomorrow, we're going to have to deal with warming out through the middle of the century. I think if we can even get some traction on Plan A, we'd be making some significant progress.
Let's take one more.
Hi, I'm Ken Pittman from Keene, New Hampshire. I actually came here to talk about how much I dislike Obama's embracing of fracking and so on, but I'm going to try not to actually focus on that and go to this question of personal investment in moving things along. And New Hampshire is a property tax state, and I never hear anybody talk about this, but it's like they charge you twice for everything that you do. Like we rent the right to own our house. And every time we upgrade our house, we pay for it when we upgrade it, and then we pay for it again later, because then the house is worth more, and somebody can tax us more. And then when I think about just the job situation and the possibility of losing jobs and paying for something while I'm unemployed and have no income, there's no homestead exemption for the property tax. And it seems weird that I'm talking about property tax. I don't come here, I'm not a property tax person. But I'm just thinking in terms of how that impacts this whole dynamic. Because I'm sitting around, I was just recently pricing solar for my house. And I'm thinking like, how am I going to afford that? And what am I going to afford if I lose my job? And I'll still have to pay my property tax. And so everything, you want people to invest in, like you're saying, wow, we should have more energy, this and that and the other. I mean, you're worried about like, am I going to be able to pay my bills next month? And I mean, the first thing I would do is just outlaw property tax, or at least make a homestead exemption for owning just a regular old home, and be able to say you can't tax somebody on just something they own like that. Because if you want somebody to put solar panels on the thing, you want them to put better insulation, you want to put something else, you're asking them to pay for something that then you're going to charge them back for. Even if you offer them the tax credit, all it's going to do is cover the future property tax. It's not going to actually help them pay for the whole thing, and the tax credits don't even cover the whole thing that you want them to do. So it's like tax people on what you don't want them to do, not what you do want them to do.
Well, Ken, the one good thing is that if you drive around the state of New Hampshire, I don't know if some of you have noticed in the last 10 years, everywhere now, it seems like there's solar panels on all kinds of different economic, range of houses. And people are starting to embrace it. I think there's an economic reason for it, but you want to take that? Jeff?
Well, I'll just speak briefly to the point that from a business perspective, being as efficient as you can possibly be is just good business, and it happens to be good for the environment as well. So if you can find ways of increasing your productivity while at the same time reducing the amount of consumption, that's ultimately what you're looking for. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see like Senator Shaheen's efforts with Senator Portman to try to bring energy efficiency, to try to promote that and stimulate that. As you reference, I think people do respond to incentives, and I think that's the approach that the senator is trying to work on with some of her colleagues in the Senate, is to try to find those right incentives, to try to bring opportunities to infuse greater awareness but greater efficiencies when you're looking at trying to make these upgrades, because it's very much a bottom line business, and you want to try to make sure that you're maximizing your opportunities to be as efficient as possible, so you can keep your overhead costs down, so you can provide your goods and services to your customers as affordably as you possibly can. So it all collectively works together, but to the point of trying to provide certain levels of incentives and to try to incentivize the right types of behavior, I do think that's the way to go. And I think that's one of the things that the Senate is attempting to do with their legislation.
Well, before we wrap up, I just want to mention that Cynthia Green is here from EPA Boston. She runs the Energy and Climate Union. Certainly someone that you want to talk to before you leave. It's been a great honor to have some wonderful people here. No one's allowed to ask Peter about free beer. That's right. And then again, have quite an expert scientist here from UNH. And Jeff, long walk.
Yes.
But particularly Nancy, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you for your service too. I'm sure that these positions are a lot of stress and a lot of tough job. And we appreciate the fact that you come all the way to New Hampshire. I think you should come back in February though, and you can see what this is all about. And I want to thank you all for coming, and please enjoy yourself at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. Thank you.